Thank you. We are back after a lunch break, back a little earlier than we had anticipated. We took a little break earlier than we anticipated. So here we are with Chris and David. Did you have a nice vacation?
It's okay. Thank you for asking. Nothing ever quite works out like you plan to. In a pandemic.
I know, mine didn't either.
Well, we made the best of it, right? Good.
Okay,
Why don't I start by just trying to orient everybody, because you've got a mass of documents and everybody should probably have this one-page document, which is the language. May I call you here?
Oh, yeah, please do.
Eric has distributed. I've also incorporated that language into the document I think we should work from, so that will be all in one place. You would also have this document, which I believe was from the treasurer's office. I don't think we need to work from this necessarily. It's good for you to have it, but thanks to Chris's great work while I was away, most of this has already been integrated in some fashion into the working statement. As to the statement, you should have two versions, and largely in part due to technological glitches and user error, mine. There's a V5 and a V6, so the bottom right corner. So consider V6 to sort of be a cleaner version. It doesn't have all track changes reflected necessarily in it. Okay, so that's for posterity and your perusal at a later time. The document from which we should work is the version 5. Okay, so there's quite a bit going on in this document. It is the statement of the issue and principles as we discussed together the last time I was here, plus a layer of changes that I made in response to the committee discussion. Those are highlighted in yellow. Then there is a sort of a third layer that's on page 2. And again, that is inclusion of Eric's statement of the issue. That's not to be presented as an either or option, but rather I didn't have time to fully integrate all of this in one place. So I dropped it here so you could see them together. And then the last piece, you'll see some track changes. Again, I'm very grateful to Chris while I was out. He did the majority of this work to help add schema and graphs and numbers, and also to incorporate the good work of the treasurer's recommendations. So I think you have a much more comprehensive document at this point, and I'm happy to walk through that, and then when there are questions, we'll try our best to answer them. Page 1, as I understand it, you wanted to move the principles to the beginning, so I've done that. And then again, the highlighted language, the yellow, is intended to reflect the discussion that you had the last time I was here. So you'll see in recruitment, retention, and public benefit, there's a new sentence at the beginning. I'm just going to zip through all of these and talk about all the principles. Under commitment, the state should honor its commitment to past, current, future public sector employees to provide a solid foundation for a secure retirement and to ensure the long-term dignity and economic well-being of its workforce. So those two concepts together, I heard a lot of discussion at the last hearing, the concept of recognizing the fact that state employees do provide critical services across the board throughout the state, and that one of the goals here is to recognize and maintain long-term dignity and economic well-being of the workforce. So I slotted those into these sort of principles. If you think they're better somewhere else, of course, I'm happy to look at that with you, however you want to proceed. The sustainability of eligibility and economic and demographic impacts for now are the same as we last saw them, but there is a whole new principle on equity. And here, any changes to the public pension system may affect different employees in different ways. To the extent possible, changes should have limited or no adverse impact on lower wage employees, employees who have historically experienced economic or social disadvantage, or employees who are at or near retirement eligibility.
So, yeah, discussion on those principles are written here. I guess. Hearing nothing. We seem to be fine unless people are still digesting.
Nothing jumping, glaring at it at this moment. I appreciate the changes.
I like the last. Pardon, Judy?
Is there anything that just, when you say at or near eligibility, is there, or should we define that? Or is there a place in there that defines that? I'm sure some people are gonna say, 7 years, 8 years, am I at or near it? I don't
think
know
that,
if clarity is better or in that particular sense, or,
I think that since this is principle.
Yep.
That if we say at or near, but when we get to the options and start
we
talking
can
about.
define it.
Then we
Fine.
would, it
It'd be
would be
defined by,
defined.
okay,
That's the way I think of this. I
Sure.
don't know if that makes sense or not.
yeah, absolutely.
That's the one sentence too, we discussed this earlier, that when you exempt some people, there are equity challenges with that, in terms of the other employees shouldering more of that load. I really like these revisions and really appreciate them. That last part is just, it's something I'm trying to think through, the equity of that provision. I don't have thoughts fleshed out at the moment.
So it's a good point. I sort of alluded to sometimes the problems you can have with language, and we use words, but sometimes they mean different things in different contexts or to different people. It's hard. Equity versus equality, they're not the same. Equality would be treating everybody equally. Equity would be meeting people where they're at and, providing them what they need in their situation. And so I think the second sentence is more a reflection of equity than equality. And if that's what you want, great. If it's not, great too, but something to certainly consider.
I like the fact that it says should have limited or no adverse impact. It doesn't say that it won't have any impact on people, but it says it should limit the impact on those people, those groups of people. Limit the adverse impact on those groups of people.
I mean, I think I brought this up and I captured it very well. So I this is how I was envisioning that right now.
Other thoughts? Okay, so we move on. If you come up with any brilliant thoughts in a while, just bring them up, okay? Or even unbrilliant. They don't have to be notes. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay.
That just out of process. If folks do have suggested edits, how does everyone think we should go about suggesting those, just so that there's transparency amongst all the committee members and stuff?
Well,
In this moment or after the?
I mean, more as a global question. I'm sure as we continue to go through this, people will have comments and edits, and maybe some of those will come after we have a chance to sit with it for a little bit too. So I just wanted to discuss how that process would play out.
well, I'll throw my thought from my perspective, I think we need to get this done as soon as we can. And I also think that if we have issues around concepts, that we know we should talk about the issues around any concepts. But with 13 of us trying to do wordsmithing, I'm not sure that we will get very far if we, but so concentrating on kind of the concepts and the, if we need to change the meaning of something as opposed to the wording. That's just my thought.
So it sounds kind of like Eric, but maybe you want to come back to that. What do you piece? I don't know if I do yet. I was just, but you know, I guess I sent some thoughts on the statement of the issue. And I don't know if we want to have a process for capturing that.
I would say if you have thoughts on it, get them out now and let's just address them, make changes as we go. But so we can finish this in the time. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So if you have thoughts.
Okay, you ready to move to the statement of the issue? Okay, again, so what you have in this document, version 5, juxtaposed are the original highlighted yellow as modified for your last discussion, and then also Eric's one pager that you had brought in next to it. Again, not intended to be some kind of either or proposition, just I think they, to some extent, can definitely be married and integrated, but there are differences a little bit in focus and policy choices. So I think the best way to do it is to sort of go through sentence by sentence and see where these, you know, sort of the spectrum of where things land. For instance, in the first one, the first sentence in yellow is just brand new to everybody. And that begins with the acknowledgement that the state of Vermont values the work and services provided by its public teachers and state employees, and is committed to providing secure and equitable retirement benefits. So again, that's a brand new sentence. Next piece, we pivot to VSERS and VSTRS are vital components of recruiting and retaining an excellent public sector workforce, but those systems are an unsustainable financial path. You'll see in Eric's language below, it's a similar concept that adequate retirement benefits are vital to recruit a qualified workforce for the effective delivery of public services and to adequately compensate public employees for their service. So, you know, this concept of recruitment and retaining definitely present in both spirit in both places. So there is some debate, I know, around the table about, you know, there's the way it's written above is the systems are on an unsustainable financial path. And in the Eric version, these systems face challenges. You know, I think there's a question about whether it's unsustainable is the right word or not. Above the original language, this is not highlighted, said neither system has enough assets today to cover the projected cost of retirement benefits that must pay out in the future. The size of the shortfall has grown significantly in recent years. Absent any changes, the cost of Vermont taxpayers and funding systems will continue to grow until the liabilities exceed the state's financial capacity to support the systems in current form and also continue to provide critical public services. That was the language that Mike Clausen had suggested towards the end of our discussion here that I brought in yellow. And then I want to jump back down now to the Eric's paragraph after the word challenges, this new highlighted matter. So the challenges include the level of employer contributions relative to the fiscal capacity of the state, as well as the predictability of expected contribution amounts. Additionally, the unfunded liability, which has grown significantly in recent years, impacts the fiscal position of the state. So absent any changes, the cost of Vermont taxpayers of funding systems are projected to grow each year through the end of the amortization period in 2038. So I think what I see or I hear sort of in the end of each version is a question of what is consequence absent changes. And I think I raised that to you all last time we were here. I I half jokingly said, is it catastrophe? Is it, an inability to continue the world as we know it? Or is it a more subdued statement of fact, which is there is a projection that they're going to keep growing that may or may not exceed the financial capacity. So a few issues in there for you all to discuss. And again, I think that the two pieces could be integrated, but there is a question of emphasis, and I'll here defer to Eric to speak to this, if that's okay with the chairs.
Thank you for introducing that. So the first sentences, I think, are essentially trying to do the same thing. I reached out to Michael to get his language because I knew he had a good suggestion on that. He said he had handed it off to you, David. So he didn't have it ready. What I was trying to do with that first sentence was just include a sentence saying why, not just what the issue is, but why we should care about the issue. And we had a discussion when we were 2 meetings ago when we were reviewing this the first time. I raised, well, what does unsustainable mean? I wasn't trying to be facetious with that. I was trying to get us to be specific about what we thought the issues were, so that when we have recommendations, we can kind of use this as a guiding statement to say, okay, does that recommendation address this issue or that issue? So that's what I tried to, and I took what I heard from the discussion around the table and tried to be specific about what the fiscal challenges were. So the capacity of the states to pay the ADEC payments, the predictability of those payments, and the level of liabilities. That's what I was trying to do, to kind of enumerate those challenges so we could use it as kind of a guide. And the changes to the last sentence were more technical, in that they're projected to grow. Whether they actually do grow or not depends on the plan experience. Like, for example, this year, they may not grow to the level we projected them to, if at all. And they are not projected to grow into infinity. At the end of the amortization period, they are projected to fall considerably. So just wanted to include that when we say grow, there's a time period to that. But again, those changes are really more technical than the enumeration of the problems, which I think is more substantive.
Discussion. Reactions.
I actually don't think Eric's statement is a statement of an issue at all. If I read his, if they got a messenger fine, I don't do anything about it.
I can-
I said if I were to look at the statement Eric's proposing, I would read it immediately and be like, there's challenges, but it's not the situation that we're actually find ourselves in. And do we actually need to do anything about the problem? And maybe that's the issue. Maybe some people at the table don't think there is a problem. And so I just don't think it's a strong enough statement from my perspective.
So saying unsustainable.
No, I think we could.
Vague terms is-
No, I think you could say challenges and unstable, but I think that last sentence in the first one really sums it up. It's not that costs are just going up. Costs go up for everything in the state of Vermont, and we are on paths that have us have special summer committees because costs are going up. The rate at which costs are going up is what has us all here this summer, and our ability to afford that rate of increase is what has us here this summer. And so to not properly recognize that, I think does a disservice to the group and to the overall paper or the project or the report, whatever you want to call it.
So I would totally be amenable to including something along the rate of increases. That last sentence is the same from absent any changes cost of taxpayers, funding the systems continue to grow. And obviously, that's all I had to work with at the previous draft of text.
But I think we need to say grow at a either unsustainable rate or at a rate we can't afford. 'Cause I mean, most of us know like cost of everything goes up with just inflation, like that in itself isn't the issue, that the costs are going up. It's how much they're going up and how much we can pay. If the costs are going up 3% a year, we wouldn't be sitting here. We just deal with it in our budget.
You know, I agree with that. I tried to capture that in the middle with the level of employer contributions relative to the fiscal capacity of the state, you know, implying that it was that the rate was an issue, but I think being more specific about the rate, I think I'd be also including that.
Madam Chair, would you entertain a suggestion from the peanut gallery? Maybe we add a couple words at the end after 2038 that says, and may outpace the growth in revenue.
I think it's stronger than may. I think it's likely. But again, that's just, just so you guys know, we spend hours debating the difference between may and now.
Oh, yeah.
So
I'm a regulator. I do that as
I
well.
guess if I could just say, and maybe it's something that we as a group might want to, I did a class on conflict resolution, right? And so I guess I looked at this as, if, I don't know where we all sit as a group, but if I hear unsustainable, to me, that means crisis. Crisis means there is no solution. I'm not sure that we're there yet. We are in conflict, that's for sure. And we don't want to be in a crisis because conflicts lead to crises. But, you know, I think we can all agree there's a conflict. And if we don't deal with it, it's going to turn into something bad. So I don't know how we get that wording out, but I don't know if as a group, we can all agree to that. But that to me is just kind of how I look at it. Like there's a problem, we know it. And if we don't do something about it, it's going to turn really bad for everybody. And I don't know how we go about doing that, but that kind of to me is the sense of when I read that, that's kind of where I'm looking at. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but
When in that line of thinking, when I read the first one here, I wrote our vital components of recruiting and retaining an excellent public sector workforce. And without structural changes, the systems are on an unsustainable path. So that it doesn't say it's going to be a crisis, but without structural changes, it is unsustainable.
we don't
So
want to
I
do that.
just added that in there thinking that would, I don't know if that helps or not.
See, to me, the unsustainable piece is the judgment part. So like you just go factual, if you cross that little part out, it's a little bit wordsmithing. But if you say workforce, but neither system has enough assets today to cover the projected costs of retirement benefits, they must pay out in the future, and the shortfall continues to grow. And then you're stating the fact of it without putting a judgment on it. The fact implies the judgment if, you know, if that's where your mind goes with this. That's a possibility. And it seemed to me the other important part of the art that I remember from our discussion was that sense of stressing the state's capacity to provide other services as well. You know, and I think it's in yours, David, at the end where you said and provide critical public services. But I'm not sure that is as clear in your version, Eric, that piece. So I just added, I was looking at Eric's and I just added and stressed the state's capacity to provide vital services. Because that felt like a part that was really important, that I heard legislators saying, that piece about, you know, if I take here, I can't give that. Peter, you were speaking to that a lot, and it made sense. You know, that feels like a part.
I will say that when I was editing the text that was there, I didn't think whether faith and challenges was I don't think it might not be strong enough either. You know, I would consider, you know, face significant fiscal challenges, something along those lines as well.
Also, just a question for the folks who are representing the public employees adequate retirement benefits doesn't seem as strong to me as secure and equitable, but that's just my perspective on it. Like adequate means just barely enough.
Yep.
So I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know from your perspective, but
I'm not tied to that first sentence at all. What I was really trying to accomplish was to capture how, what Michael said, and to provide an introductory sentence that basically stated why the issue is important to address it. I'm amenable to that, what Michael heard as the first sentence.
Can I ask you a clarifying question? I thought I heard you say we were working on version 6, but then other people think it's version 5. Did I miss? Did I say 5?
5 is the one
Five,
from
okay,
which
my
we
bad.
were.
Thank you.
So if I may, I guess what I need to know is, does the task force want to make the assertion that the path the state is on, systems are on, is unsustainable? That's sort of the threshold question. And I hear that there's value judgment in that concept, absolutely. I mean, it's not literally on a path to where we can't pay for it until we devote 100% of our dollars to pensions, right? That's not the case, but does everybody at least agree that we're on a path where what we have to pay for pensions as projected will begin to exceed the state's willingness to both do what it does on the services side and to continue to fund pensions the way we do? That's what I think I meant what everybody's saying when they say unsustainable. It's not literally unsustainable, but it is sustainable in the sense that at some point this conflict becomes unavoidable and something's got to give.
So if you did what Molly suggested here, took out on the sixth line after workforce and just took out, but the systems are on an unsustainable financial path, and then put that neither system has it, leave that in, neither system has enough, and then leave that last sentence in there, which says that they will, without changes, they will continue to grow until it exceeds the state's ability to pay.
That's fine by me. That's sort of my question is, should we
yeah, I think
jettison
that's a fair compromise.
I think that it's been compromised.
We prefer the are projected instead of continue to grow. The are projected to grow, as opposed to will continue to grow. Will sounds like a guarantee.
Well, I think they will continue to grow.
They're projected to grow, right? But like Eric was saying, there's a big year again on investment returns.
They're still gonna grow.
again. There's nuance behind this question. So if we hit every single actuarial assumption going forward till 2038, the normal cost and the unfunded liability payments will both continue to grow year over year. The difference is how much more will it grow over the prior year? And that's really what happens in the fund from year to year, and the valuation will dictate just how much that increase will be next year compared to last year. But the normal cost is projected to increase at pace with payroll, which is 3.5% a year for teachers, 3% a year for the teachers. And the unfunded liability payments are structured to increase 3% over the prior years. So there's a little bit of nuance around this question. Eric's right that like how much definitely matters on what's going on in the fund. But generally speaking, the trajectory is upward because that's our amortization method.
Gotcha.
You could have a year that's good enough to decrease the ADF payment.
From 1 year to the next,
Yeah, that's
but
what I
going
project.
forward from then, they'll keep going up.
Yep. Yep,
Unless
totally
there
agree.
are massive demographic changes that we can't anticipate right now. There's always things like that could happen, but
Let's hope.
no.
Demographics.
Yeah, please.
Things like that, that's another stuff.
The demographics haven't been in our favor in the past recent years. Unfortunately.
So is there consensus on saying is projected to grow rather than will continue to grow? Okay. Well, let me put that together and then you can see it one last time and I think. All right. So those sort of, value laden issues were really the hotspots. But you'll see there's a lot of good data and information added to this, thanks to Chris from the treasurer's office. It sort of fleshes out the numbers. He made sure all of the numbers were correct, that we're talking about the right time periods, that we're comparing apples to apples. Rather than go through every bit of that right now for the moment, let me just point out the rest of the highlighting to make sure that I captured the changes you asked me to make from your last discussion. And then we can take as close a look at the new matter as you want with Chris. So I am to what, page 6, I think. And not referring to Representative Fagan's question about the history of employee contributions, which I think there is a chart we could put there.
There's some yellow highlight on page 5. Very, very bottom.
That's just, yeah, that's, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
That's a placeholder, so I remember to put a graphic in there.
Oh, okay.
I didn't have enough time to get every single graphic
Okay.
done that I want done.
Got it. I just saw the yellow.
So what I'm referring to, the paragraph down at the bottom of 6, in addition to the normal cost, the unfunded liability, the gap between the cost of future benefits, assets, the unfunded liability arises from prior years of underperformance relative to assumptions, legacy underfunding of the employer contribution, and increased costs from changes to assumptions. Okay, so that new matter, legacy underfunding of the employer contribution, I think it was Molly's point, just to have the, sort of the history holistically reflected there. Is everybody okay with that?
I think it's important to leave in prior to 2007. I have a lot of people who have said we've been underfunded. I said we've funded it more than 100%. That, it's important to leave in 2007.
Clarification about that when you say that. I always wonder if I'm misremembering something, but my understanding is that there was a time period in there where it was being funded 100% or more, but that some of those funds were going toward the OPEB. Is that?
So when, up until 2015, and I don't know how far back it goes, the OPEB employer contribution was coming from the corpus of the fund. And that means, I always use $25 million a year. It's basically the fund, day 1, July 2nd, and used to pay for the overhead costs for retired teachers, not state employees. State employees were budgeted annually and paid for in general. So several people got together, most notably the old member from Knoll, and came up with a plan to get us on to what is now known as a payment system. And so, yes, that was done. But until that actually came into the appropriations committee, I had never heard that we were pulling money out to pay for.
Yeah. But there was this little window like 2007 to 14 where that's kind of.
Well, I think it was, I don't know what the whole time was that was going on. I don't believe it was starting from 7 to 14.
Okay.
I think it was longer. I don't know. And again, when the appropriation committee found out about it, was the same time that House GovOps found out about it, and a member of House GovOps took action immediately, and we fixed the issue. So it's one of those things you can't fix what you don't know about. There are so many obvious complicated pieces to a pension system and an open system. It's almost impossible for even a small group of people to understand the whole thing.
And if I could just add, we addressed, there's a bullet point in one of the future pages here that talks about the teacher. The slides I handed out earlier today that we spent a lot of time talking about the drivers of the unfunded liability, shows you what the impact was. And it's, you know, when you look just within the confines of the current closed amortization schedule, which is FY 09 to 38, that added, I think, about 155 or so $1 million to the growth in the unfunded liability at that time. So it's not a trivial amount of money, but it's a relatively small portion of the total growth in the unfunded liability. So Representative Fagan's right, where the way the math works, that basically was an actuarial loss in the system. So we would pay the ADAC, that would be an actuarial loss, and that loss was factored into the calculation of subsequent ADAC payments.
Thank you for your patience as I learned some of this stuff. Repeat now.
No, I
It's
appreciate it.
complicated. Yeah. That was good.
So I think the only other one for this portion of our discussion on the next page sort of raises the same issue here, despite the employer fully funding, and in some years more than fully funding the actuarially required amount since 2007, unfunded liabilities have grown significantly. So again, I think everybody wants the record to just accurately reflects the historical legacy. So with that, I think we can hop back to page 2, to beginning with background. And again, Chris has dressed this up to make it look more like one of his excellent presentations, with charts and numbers and data. And I think I will allow him to do that if you're okay with it.
Sure. So I don't want to go word for word through this, but I just want to give everybody a sense of what I did here. I really did take the bones of the product we left the last meeting with and add a little bit of meat to it, a little more context, some graphics, some more substance, and some of the feedback we received, particularly from the treasurer's office, pointed out some areas of nuance that are worth highlighting. So I tried to do that throughout here, but obviously this is very much a draft. It's a work in progress. But I started off here in the background where this is really teeing up what happened in the recession and what prompted the state to take a look at this back in 2009. So we really saw a really big year-over-year impact from the Great Recession. These numbers you've seen from other materials, and they also came directly from the 2009 report. So really the first couple pages here are an attempt to distill the key findings for why we were looking at this back in 2009 into something really, really skinny and short. So the bottom of page 2, we just highlight the year-over-year deterioration in the funded ratios of both systems that were caused by the Great Recession. So 15% roughly decline in the funded ratio system in 1 year. Then I reorganized a few things on page 3 just to try to make things flow a little bit easier. I don't think the changes are substantive. I did add some nuance in the aging workforce bullet point that, as this is one of those things where having more retirees actives in and of itself does not signal a crisis, because pension systems are designed to pay out benefits. And all this stuff goes into the formulas that the actuaries use when calculating the normal cost. The problem we run into is when you have a really, really rapid maturity of the plan and you have a lot more people retiring, and that ratio of actives to inactives changes. When you couple that with a plan that isn't really robustly funded, it becomes really, really challenging to dig yourself out of that hole. Because like we talked about earlier, the more people you have drawing money out of the system is less money that you have in the asset pool to just keep growing with interest. So we tried to add just a little bit of nuance there, that it's a risk factor when you have a pension plan mature, and that risk is multiplied when you have deterioration of the funded ratio happening around the same time. So I just wanted to make sure we're making that point clear. We can make it clearer, but I just want to make sure we all understood what that was. And the treasurer's office was really helpful with highlighting that nuance. Some of these other findings really come right out of the executive summary of the 2009 report. I'm on page 4 now. there is a section here that this is kind of a placeholder, but where it says update since the 2009 commission. This section, I think the intent here is to start fleshing out a little bit, all right, what's happened since that commission took a look under the hood and offered some recommendations. This timeline is a work in progress. It needs to be fleshed out and probably added to, but I wanted to put and transcribe here in one table the timeline that was in the treasurer's annual report and also in her testimony a few weeks ago, just so we have it and we're familiar with it. And if there's things here that we want explained further, we can do that. But I think the intent here is just to be able to say, all right, in one section, this is what happened to cause us to look at it in 2009. What has happened since then to the issues? And then start going in a little bit more detail around sort of, call it scope of the problem here, about really bringing it to why we're talking about this. And those factors which are starting to be detailed on page 6. We talk a little bit about just the different costs and then the cost trends over time. So I tried to add some clarity around kind of who pays for what. And this is just more for background. We don't necessarily need to go word for word, but I wanted to make sure we had a place to talk about what the difference is between a normal cost and an unfunded liability amortization payment and how the state pays for those. We'll add a chart response to Representative Fagan's question about the history of employee contribution rates. We can do that. And I added a footnote at the end just to try to be clear about the timing issues involved in all of this, just to remind people that as you start looking through the charts and the data, that just to remind that there's a lag between when we measure and when we make the budget decision. So what happens at the end of, this as an example, what happens at the end of fiscal 20 / beginning of FY21, which is in the FY20 valuation, impacts the next full budget year, so FY22. So in a very long way of what happens in FY20 influences what we pay in FY22.
I'm just, Molly, so to further answer the question. So the one that's version 6, on page 4, it's the one that Chris was just going over, version 6.
I thought it was 5. We're on 5.
Okay, well, I'm good. 6. All written in the same sheet of paper. Yes, okay, so version 5, excuse me, version 5, page 5. The 2015 Teachers OPEB reform created the Retired Teachers Health and Medical Benefits Fund. That's the pay up. That is the pay up.
Peter, where is that again?
Okay, so it's the version 5, page 5.
Big box, right?
Page 5, 2015 Teachers OPEB reform, the first bullet.
Thank you.
That is the pay up.
And an answer to the question of when that began, which says dating back to the 1980s.
In the 1980s, that's practice very serious.
Well, that's what the second bullet on page 5 under
Oh, there-
Feaster's
yeah,
OPEB reform, the second bullet.
Are there any questions on page 5 or on page 6?
Do you want to put in your timeline what happened in 2021?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just, in 2021, we put aside $150 million if we came up with structural changes to, right, if we came up with some workable options. And we changed the makeup of the VPIP board, which you haven't mentioned here at all. And we set up this task force. I don't know if that's important or not, but it is part of the timeline.
It's a really good catch. You can add that.
It's also, where it's 2020 and it says in the return lower to 7.0, can we say from 7.5, just because those reading this might have know that.
So back on page 7, I just added some narrative here around how we pay, how we, the employer, pay the cost in terms of what gets assessed to what fund of the government in each of the systems. And we'll also add a chart here that shows how these costs are broken out by fund. I want to make sure I have the latest data on the PSERS funding allocation before I do that, because those are all based on what percentage of the active payroll is funded by each fund of state government. And those numbers are relatively consistent from year to year, but they change a little bit. And right now, with all the federal money coming in, it could really change things. So I don't want to rely on what I have from a, I'm going to ask for the latest data on that. And then I added some charts here at the bottom of page 7 and onto the following page. It just attempts to show what's happened over time in each system with respect to the unfunded liability and the funded ratio. So the blue line represents the unfunded liability and ties into that axis over on the left side. And the orange on my version line shows how as the blue line gets up, the unfunded liability grows, the funded ratio declines. And I drew a line here right at the beginning of, right at the 2008 mark, because that right there is fiscal year ending June 30th, 2008 is essentially when the amortization period started. So everything to the right of that line, that vertical line, is within the current 30-year amortization period. Same story on the next page on that chart. I added, going back to our earlier conversation about this document, to draw your attention to the words at the end of that first paragraph on page 8, just to see if folks are comfortable with how that is characterized. We can also edit that, but is and may ultimately exceeds the state's fiscal capacity to pay. And I also, toward the bottom of page 8, tried to add some nuance around the question that Eric raised on an earlier section around projected future costs, but happy to entertain any suggestions on that also.
Can we take out ultimately?
I'm sorry?
Because I think it went with, when that was will, right there, and that exceed the state's fiscal capacity.
Yeah, I said has also grown significantly and may ultimately exceed the state's fiscal capacity.
She just has to take out the word ultimately.
Okay, gotcha. What?
Sure. Chris, I think I like the chart on page 9. I think what would also be really helpful though is a table of what a certain set of prior year ADAC payments were relative to general fund, percent relative to general funds, and going forward. I know we have budget projections through 2026 or general fund projections through 2026. I don't think actually, the amortization schedule goes out to 2038. I think the normal costs are only projected a shorter few
Normal
years.
costs
but
will keep going in perpetuity as long as we have active members.
If we could see that, just kind of see the impact of what the changes last year did, and then also how they fit into some of our recent, the recent fiscal climate. I think that will help provide some perspective. And then in the out years, as Peter said, that it's going to project to grow again. 3% more than 2.5.
Yeah.
So thank you, Erica. One of the things that I'm wondering if it's in this document. Are we addressing the smoothing aspect of that are reflected that are actually smoothed over a period of 5 years? Because there will be individuals who are going to say, well, wait a minute, it made 24% last year. So that's going to impact what we're paying in next year. When in fact, what they're going to count on smooth down to.
So that's an excellent point. That's not in this section. I think that is, there's a lot of merit in including that in the context of investment experience and noting that because, yeah, your point is excellently taken because we had a really good year this past year, but that will be offset by the fact that we only get to realize 20% of that gain in any given year. And we also, across both systems, in total, have $180 million worth of deferred losses from prior years that have not been recognized yet. So those losses are going to eat away at some of those gains we just got. And we also need that valuation to show us what happened on the demographic experience and everything else, because the COLA, as we mentioned earlier, is likely to be an area of actuarial loss because the consumer price index has just outpaced where it's been in years and what we projected it would be for the most recent fiscal year. So that's an excellent point.
I want to make sure that it's in there because just folks don't understand.
Yep.
And frankly, when I walked in, I thought it was 3 years. So
And to Representative Fagan's point, 5-year smoothing is pretty common. We're not an outlier with having 5-year smoothing. A lot of people don't necessarily realize we do this, but pension systems across the country, you'll typically find 5-year smoothing. And that is to, as we've talked about, smooth out that year-to-year volatility. So you can manage your budgeting with some level of predictability. So you don't have costs going wildly up and down from year to year based on what happened in the market a year prior. And to Eric's point, yeah, I think we can add a graph that shows revenue growth overall. I'm not sure focus on general fund in and of itself is going to be the most helpful because we only use the general fund money to, not all the costs fall on the general fund. We need to look sort of holistically across state government too, because, and across all of our revenue sources. We always look at the general fund as a legislative body pretty closely because that's the most flexible pot of money. And that's the money we use to do a lot of new programs or new initiatives or really keep the lights on and maintain core operations in a lot of our departments. But the reality is a lot of these costs do fall on federal funds, fall on the transportation fund, the education fund. So looking at all that revenue growth together, I think we can put.
and really you're going to have separate charges.
Oh, yeah.
Because the state employees is roughly 40% general fund and the teachers is over 90% general fund. So
That's correct.
That'll be only separate charges.
Yeah, the normal cost falls to the ed fund for the teacher pension and the unfunded liability falls to the general fund.
Guess what I'm trying to get at with that is getting at that concern of the capacity to pay, which I think is more of a crunch on when it comes to compete with other general fund priorities rather than getting federal funds for some of those expenses. And there are places in the document, at least in the prior document, where it says, in this year is X% of general fund dollars. It would be helpful for me to see how that is out in a bit of a consecutive year timeline and how the changes, affected that, and how we'll look going in future budget. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at.
General question. So the audience here is the legislature, but it's also anyone who wants to read it. Right? So I was thinking about what Evelyn was saying, and also just about all the vocabulary. Is there a plan to have either an appendix or upfront, like here are some basic general concepts, and here's the vocabulary?
We can add a glossary page, which is typical when you're dealing with pensions to have a glossary page.
And I don't know what the glossary would be for what you were saying, but it feels like that. It feels like a glossary.
You're absolutely right.
I also think that will become the basis for our report.
Yep.
Yeah.
But my feeling about this is that this is, the audience for this is the people out there. The people that we're trying to get to on the same page as we hopefully will all get on about this is the problem, this is where we are, and these are the challenges. So that it's the other 147 legislators and the 8,000 teachers and the 8,000 state employees and all their other taxpayers out there who have an interest in this, so that they can understand what the problem is. When the report actually comes out, it'll be more geared, I think, to it'll be a general report, but it'll be a report to the legislature.
So just teacher hat here, teaching technique wise, vocabulary upfront.
Right.
Or anything else, and also summary upfront, so that you summarize key concepts, then people have a frame of reference in which to put the detail. So that's why I'm suggesting those things could happen toward the beginning.
So on page 10, this kind of gets to what Eric just noted about the impact of different funds. I think we can put some graphics in here and, some feedback that the treasurer raised that the treasurer's office raised that I thought was valuable was not just looking at the general fund. I mean, we can look at impacts of the general fund, but also look at an all funds picture across state government. Again, just because a lot of what we do as a state involves more than one funding source, and these costs hit more than one funding source. So just providing some more context around how much pension costs as sort of a government activity stack up with other sort of government activities across all funds. So we can slug that in.
Is there something more, you got starts with put in broader context?
Yeah.
Is there something else going there, or just, it seems to just,
That's-
programs including and then it ends?
That's going to be the placeholder.
Gotcha, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
For FY 2022, is that number updated for the new FY 22 general fund projections?
These numbers will all be based on FY 22. And FY 22's budget is based on the January revenue forecast. They're not based on the July revenue forecast. It's just due to timing reasons. So the July revenue forecast and actual collections may impact any changes that are made through BAA, but really there tends to be a lag. So it will really influence the upcoming budget. You're always working on data and projections that are a little bit stale, if you will. And working on a monthly basis, are your collections outpacing your projections?
The work that JFO and the administration did for the emergency board doesn't capture.
Now, the FY 22 budget's already been passed. It was passed 2 months before we got those revenue projections. Those are based on the older projections.
But I will say this, the FY 22 budget did, for the first time in my memory, wording included that if the general fund revenues came in better than thought they would, that we would replace some of the spending with ARPA money, excuse me, with general fund money, and then use put the ARPA money back to those large $1.5 billion, those large pots, so that we can then address the state of Vermont's structural needs like broadband, et cetera. So that in fact occurred because money did come in better than expected. We did have some left at the end of the year, and the money that was left at the end of the year, we have your construct that's in the statute. Half of it goes into a spendable rate savings account, the other half went into retired state employees.
It's been a weird couple budget years here. The collections have been very different than projections, and it's due in large part to all the federal stimulus money that's flowing through the economy. And on top of that, an awful lot of money has gone out the gate to state governments, and states have had to make lots of decisions on compressed timelines on how to spend the money with imperfect information about the guidelines and what are the best uses of the money. So to Representative Fagan's point, a lot of times you have to pass a budget based on the best information you have at the time and build some contingency in. So if certain things pan out a different way, certain funding sources can be reverted. And that's also the first things the legislature does when they come back in session is something called the Budget Adjustment Act. And the BAA is when, you basically take a look underneath the hood and any adjustments to that year's budget based on how things are going and what, you're likely to need between that halfway point in the fiscal year and the end. So it's not like you just pass the budget and walk away and never look at it again. Like every 6 months or so, people take a pretty good look at, you're either passing a new budget or you're making some tweaks to the one you're currently under. So at the bottom of page 10, this section starts by putting some bullet points together around some of the causes of the growth of the liabilities over time. And I don't, other than the heading, which uses the word unsustainable, I tried to phrase it so Vermont's pension and OPEB liabilities have grown significantly and at a rate faster than state revenues, to try to take the subjectivity of the word unsustainable out. And then just tried to detail a little bit what some of these were. So the underfunding pre-2008, that should be 2006. I fixed it once, but not twice. And that just talks about, you know, the fact that the legacy underfunding that happened prior to the current amortization period led to the unfunded liability on the teacher pension plan and did add some cost to that. We would need the actuaries to model out exactly what that cost would be from year to year, but it added some cost to the ADAC that we've paid for all 30 years, and it's kind of baked in, if you will, to the base of the ADAC that we're paying. It is not responsible for the giant growth we saw from FY21 to FY22. It's just kind of built into the base of the ADAC we've been paying throughout the amortization period. Page 11 talked about the Great Recession impacts and the actuarial rate of return. Tried to add a little bit of nuance here and incorporate some feedback that was really helpful from the treasurer's office, just to highlight the fact that, you know, whatever rate of return you choose does not affect the performance or the outcomes of the fund or dictate your investment policy. You know, that assumed rate of return is really based on a forward-looking projection of what people think the markets are going to act like in the next few years. And part of that is also like an inflation assumption and a risk-free return element. So it's a very, very complicated calculation. And then you want to make sure your investment allocation is actually going to get you to what your assumption is going to be. But it's not that one set of numbers drives the other. The assumed rate of return really is calculated in sort of a very specific way. And then you just make sure that your investments are going to get it. Because if you're assuming 7%, you put all your money in treasury bills, I mean, you're never going to get 7%. So, but you know, the point we're trying to make here is you don't say, I think we can do 10 or 12%, and then artificially build a portfolio that will get you to 10 or 12 because you're going to bake in a lot of risk and volatility. That's just not the way it's done. I also put a graphic in here from NASRA that just shows what the nationwide trends have been, and tried to highlight that, you know, we were once at 8.25%, and now that we're down at 7%, you know, that we are in line with the median of major banks surveyed by NASRA as of August, as of this month. Any questions? There's a lot of reorganization. Yes, sir.
Can you just remind me, when did we go from 8.25 to 7.5?
That is a great question. We will have to add that to a timeline in here because it has been changed a couple times. I just don't know off the top of my head.
Went to 8 first. And
Yeah.
Then 7.5.
And there were a couple years with the select and ultimate system for a while too, which was complicated to explain. But can add that. On page 12, I just did a lot of reorganization and scratched out a few things. And you know, the initial draft kind of used a lot of words from the 2009 report about how we stacked up to other systems back then. I'm not sure it's super relevant right now, so I scratched it in the context of space economy and just tried to focus on the fact that we're in line with sort of nationwide trends around what we've done with the actuarial rate of return since then.
Just a quick thing on page 11, the bottom section, it says while a lower assumed 8 of return.
Hey,
Oh.
you get 2 stickers today.
Okay, we're doing it because you want to.
Yes,
You
yes,
just want a
yes.
sticker.
Yeah, just one second. When you said that pre-2006, it is pre, it's pre-2007.
Yes, it should be 2006. Yeah,
Yeah.
pre-2007. So page 12, talk about the impact of teacher OPEB practice. And tried to add a little bit of context around, when we use the words demographic and experience factors, what do we really mean? And try to translate that into English. I'm sure I could do a much better job than I did, but trying to just add a little bit of context around what these bullet. Page 13 is just the list of what all these assumptions are based on how the actuary we have tracks them and tries to explain, where appropriate, what they are. So, net turnover, instead of using that word, I try to say member termination or turnover rates for reasons other than retirement. And toward the bottom of page 13 and onto the next 2 pages, I added some detail from the slide deck that I distributed to everybody earlier today about the drivers of the unfunded liability during the course of the amortization period since 2009. So you can see demographic experience is responsible for, 217 and on the state side and 482.9 million on the teacher side. These numbers were edited primarily because I counted things just in different categories. I categorized things differently, and I just made sure that the time frame we were working on is consistent with the frame of the amortization schedule. So sometimes you talk about 2007, 2008. I thought it was helpful to try to make sure we're comparing apples to apples by tracking what has happened within the confines of the current closed amortization period, because that really is what has driven the fact that the hole has gotten deeper since then. And then page 14, I tried to depict all these things in a somewhat busy graphic, but it's a busy topic, just to show the things that were actuarial gains and losses, and take those words and that chart I set around with the really, really tiny print and put it into some bar charts. So you can see anything that's above the line here increased the unfunded liability cumulatively between FY09 and FY20. The factors you see that are negative or below the line are factors that decrease the unfunded liability. Those represent actuarial gains. So you see the COLA experience, for example, was $122 million actuarial gain for the state system. And that's just because inflation rates and the CPI have not been as high up to this point as we had assumed they would be. So that's what that means in plain English.
First, just to point out, I presume you've got FY09 is after the end of the stock market's fall due to the Great Recession. And on the upturn, are you talking June of July of FY09?
So going back to the smoothing, some of the impacts.
No, not going to the smoothing, but what I'm saying here is that these actuary experiences, actuarial assumptions take into account none of the bad side of the market from the Great Recession. It's all after that the shock.
So these numbers in 2009 do include the impacts from the Great Recession.
The start of it, but it doesn't include the ride down. Is that the way I want to say it?
It includes some of that, I believe. It includes the ride down and the ride up. And again, the impacts are smoothed over 5 years. So what happens in FY09 will be felt for future years. So it reflects both the ride down and ride up. Same data on page 15, just for the teacher side. And I tried to add some little short charts here at the bottom of 15 and 16 that I think you've all seen before that just show how assets and liabilities have compared to one another. Then the OPEB section on page 16 and 17, the edits were not particularly substantial. I made some grammatical edits and tried to add some context around the fact that the standardized discount rate that the GASB rules force us to use when calculating our OPEB liabilities is heavily dependent on federal monetary policy and interest rates because it's tied to a municipal bond rate. And the Treasurer's Office pointed out some helpful nuance around OPEB costs and Medicare that, we wanted to make it clear that it's the per member premium cost of providing benefits is higher in the years when somebody is retired but before they're eligible for Medicare. It's not that retirees as a whole who are not yet eligible for Medicare cost more than the rest of the world. We wanted to make sure we were comparing like things, and it's really like the per member cost that we're looking at. And lastly, on this section, I added a little bit of this nuance and context around pre-funding OPEB and made a point about the infusion of one-time funds from the unrestricted FY21 general fund surplus going into the teachers or the state employee OPEB trust. That, and again, thanks to the treasurer for flagging this as a helpful point, could reduce some of the sort of startup costs with pre-funding. You know, you need to put some slug of money in it at the outset to get rolling and to protect yourself against volatility in the short term. But you also still need to bake in that sort of incremental cost every year above the pay-go amount. And that although that's in the ballpark of roughly $20 million, you really want to make sure that the actuaries are costing this out based on, you know, you want to give them a scenario that you want them to model based on the exact time frame you want them to reach 100% funded and the method by which you want to do it. But every number I've seen up to this point gives you that ballpark of roughly $20 million or so above the pay-go amounts in each system to build up that head of steam over time and make sure you eventually have enough assets in the portfolio to fund those benefits, investment returns. That's it.
I know, is that something that actually recalculate or will be recalculated anyway?
We can ask them to recalculate it. We just need to ask them what we would want them to model.
Yeah. Thank you.
It should not be I don't speak for them, but it should not be a particularly heavy lift. They've done similar modeling in the past. It's just a matter of giving them the parameters and the scenario that you want them to cost in. The big catch with all this is, you know, you could plan what you think your healthcare costs are going to be in the future, but it's notoriously difficult to predict with any real accuracy because you can base it on healthcare inflation trends and data sets out there, but a lot of it is influenced by claims experience, what kind of deal you can negotiate with your providers, and you know, just in general, what's happening with Medicare policy also.
We should be very specific to the actuary when we ask them. The treasurer presented two different sets of numbers, one for research, one for research. One contains a full amortization table and the other does not.
Right. And one is based on a 8X scenario that is similar to what we're comfortable with pensions, where, you know, there's a normal cost and an unfunded liability that are amortized by an assumed rate of payroll growth every year. And there's also a scenario that was costed out for the teacher OPEB with a series of 10% annual increases for a few years and 3% annual increases after that. So you would want to make sure you're telling them, hey, model them based on these payment structures starting on this year through this year, and give them some sense of what you're assuming that the annual growth will be, you know, whether you're doing a level percent of pay or a level dollar.
Okay, so where are we here, folks? In terms of, I think that the yellow highlighted, because we made decisions on those. Eric, have you had future further thoughts on this?
I have not at the moment. Just digesting the additional language.
So are there questions or concerns about the red parts here that Chris put in and the treasurer's office put in that are background information? They're not judgments or it's just really background information. Are there issues with any of those?
I wouldn't really necessarily have time to digest it, but maybe we could give ourselves homework to like digest within 24 or 40 hours, whatever would give you enough time to then give us a, you know, get anything to you directly or something like that. Or I don't know if that's appropriate for the work committee, but it's hard to digest that quickly.
Yeah, I think that it would be a little cumbersome for David and or Chris, if 13 people
Yeah.
sent in our changes, our comments, our suggestions. So I don't know if we want to, how we want to do that. And again, I would ask, I think, that we do it by kind of concepts and stuff rather than wordsmithing. Because I think that we did do some wordsmithing on the statement of the issue and look at the principles, but the rest of it, I don't know that we need to do a lot of wordsmithing, so. What do you think is the best way to do this? Just bring all our suggestions and.
Well, if people understand we're not going to wordsmith this to death, then I think sharing everybody's thoughts with the whole task force and person David.
So send them?
Yeah, or just send them around, and as long as everybody understands that, you know, we're not gonna wordsmith the entire document, because that would be difficult for David and Chris to deal with from 13 separate people.
I'm sure we can all agree as a group, though, on every wordsmith, right?
No, I mean, it's more like put a comment rather than,
Or a question.
or a question, rather than editing the document. I guess that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we'll just do that.
Does that make sense, Kevin?
Get comments or questions or concerns.
Okay.
What's a good, like, deadline? So would you want to say by Friday at a certain time, so we give time to do your work for this week?
At the end of the week, we can always decide.
And we- Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you. All right, so next on our agenda, we have, thank you. Sorry to cause such motion there at before lunch.
Version 6 or anything? No, okay, we can set that.
We need what?
Version 6, I just was like.
Oh, I see.
don't think we need that.
Oh.
It's been changed, but
I just wrote yes and no on them.
I'm more of a Richard.
All right, so I think that next on our agenda, we had kind of starting to think about the brainstorming options that we have. And we've had some presented to us. I, for my own edification, not for anybody else's, did my little list here of the options that I think have been presented to us up to this point. And if anybody else has their little list?
But options, now you're saying options for considerations of things to examine with regards to any sort of benefit changes or the way they're funded or use of funding.
Right,
That's
right.
what we're
How, what kind of options are there out there that we can consider that will help us solve the dilemma?
And are we thinking right now also, you know, so I've been thinking of things that we want the actuaries to start to crunch. So there are some things I would love to have them run with specific numbers. With regards to revenue, thinking about a dedicated revenue stream with different numbers, 30 million, 50 million, 75 million. See how that would impact the system.
I didn't understand what the actuary would run.
Looking at how having a dedicated revenue source of, let's say, $30 million that comes in each year, or $50 million each year, or $75 million that comes in each year, with those funds being dedicated towards pension costs, how that would impact the unfunded liabilities and the direct payments.
I don't, I think Chris can answer that, but I don't think the actuary.
I don't
can do
think
that.
Yeah, so I think it would depend on, I guess, how you're envisioning the revenue work. So, you know, I think there's a couple options here that the legislature will have to ultimately decide.
if there's an additional revenue source, how is that money credited to the fund? Does that money come into the budget and help pay for the ADAC, for example? Or does that money get sort of put in a lot of money and then put into the pension fund at the end of the fiscal year? And if the latter, that would change the future amortization. It would not change the normal cost, but it could have an impact on the unfunded liability going forward. And they may be able to model it, tell them what amount, starting what year.
I think that's what Andrew was speaking to.
Yeah, of having that run, going through those scenarios there. I guess I'm confused the difference between.
So, I mean, one could need to use more money coming out of a lot of money that we use. So very much yeah, right. It just, it's mixed with different revenues. Another option could be there's money that comes in, and whatever is collected from it is put in after the year for that year that's already in the budget. And that will ultimately result in saving the future ADAS. Right.
Yeah.
Right. It works.
So I did have, on my list here, I did have dedicated funds or one time and as an option of what we look at, but, and had the question on there, is it to offset existing or is it on top of? And I guess when we talk about dedicated funds or additional revenue sources, we need to start talking about what they are. I mean, we need to make a suggestion to the legislature that these are the funds that we want dedicated to this. And then is that I will share this with you now that I don't like dedicated funds in general. For almost anything, because, and I'm not saying there shouldn't be more money put into this, but I'm saying dedicated funds means that the appropriations committees are hampered by making decisions. If you have $100 million and 80 million of that is dedicated to certain things, then you only have 20 million to try and figure out how to spend. If you have an opioid epidemic, or you have a pandemic like this, or you have something, tropical storm Irene, you have something happen, you only have $20 million. You can't use it here, even though it might make sense for you to be able to take that whole $100 million and figure out how to use it wisely. It's just like when you're doing your home budget, your own personal budget. You need to have enough flexible money that you can make changes. If your car breaks down, to spend $500. I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but in my mind, dedicated funds hamper the ability of our appropriations committees to spend the money where it's the most needed at the time. And that, I'm not saying that whether or not there should be more money put into the pension, into the retirement system, but where it comes from in the general fund, in my mind, should be up to the appropriations committees instead of dedicating a revenue stream to that. It goes into the appropriations money, and then they say, so we could make a recommend. That's
So,
just, I will.
Jeanette, I just want, I'm gonna say, would you be more apt to say, and I'm just using appropriate, we'd like to dedicate $20 million and then let them find the money? Is that what you're saying?
If we.
Instead of saying we want $20 million from this specific place, we would like $20 million, but wherever you get it from, we really don't care.
Yes,
make sense?
if we feel that there needs to be more money put into the retirement system,
Okay.
then we say that.
Yep.
If they say it should come from cannabis revenue or from purchase and sales agreements or sales or general income tax.
Sure.
Yeah, you're right.
so
That's
10.
exactly what I was trying to say. Thank you.
All right.
You said it much better than I did. But that's just my personal,
Yeah,
other
no.
people have different opinions, so,
Yeah.
but that, so I did have that question here for dedicated funds. What are we talking about with dedicated funds? Are we talking about saying increasing the sales tax, or that wouldn't go anyway? Are we talking about income tax? Are we talking about cannabis revenue? So people who want a dedicated revenue fund need to,
Right, and so I think the ones we spoke about are cannabis, and when Graham Campbell was presenting us with some numbers last time, we had this information there. Also, I know on gambling, they didn't have an exact number that I think they had kind of a little ballpark. But thinking that also, Graham was talking about the capital gains exemption, that Vermont's one of the 9 states in the country that has that. And eliminating the capital gains exemption, instead of bringing 15 million to 20 million a year. So, you know, those are kind of the 3 big ones that are jumping back to me. I know we brought up before, increased income tax on earners over $400,000. I think we need to explore more conversations there. Yeah, I feel like we presented a couple ideas. I would love to hear what other people at the table have for thoughts on other revenue sources. I can't imagine that I'm the only person that's had some thoughts on that.
I'll just add, I think it might benefit the discussion to kind of parse out. There's a discussion of where the money comes from, but I think, Andrew, what you were asking originally is what would be the impact of supplemental dollars put into the, directed towards the unfunded liability of a certain amount? How would that affect future ADAP payments? That's more of an actuary question. But the implementation question is important too. How does that practically happen? Those are some great options. Yeah, I would. I'd love to hear some thoughts as well from folks if they think anything's particularly feasible or not feasible.
well, I think I've made my statement here about dedicated funds. So whether or not we suggested that more money go into it, I have no issue with. We could suggest that, but I don't want to say where it comes from. It's my position.
I just want to add to that conversation. I don't have any suggestions yet, but I just want to have a conversation. Because I said something at lunch that I think is a little constructive here to help drive home the point. The state of Vermont's IT infrastructure needs, this is just the state of Vermont, is in excess of a $1 billion bill. Now, we found 50 some odd million dollars this year, but it is in excess of a $1 billion. What does it contain? The access system to the Agency of Human Services is over 40 years old. The functioning of it is, I always think it's tenuous. And if it were to crumble, how does the Agency of Human Services work? I don't know. We all saw the problems with the Department of Labor system, which turned 50 this past year. That's a system where the federal government was giving us money, and we entered into a consortium with 2 other states that fell apart. No fault of our own, it just fell apart. So there are needs that the Appropriation Committee has to weigh on an annual basis. And the issue with the Appropriation Committee is we're the only committee that sees the whole picture. Each of the committees sees a part of the picture. It all comes together in our committee. And someone talks about, we need money over here because it's about to die, versus over here to wait another year. You don't want to wait another year. That's the choice that we have to make each and every year, and it's really hard. So just to kind of further explain.
And I into just the question of like where ARPA funds can and can't be attributed. So like broadband, for example, is one where you can use ARPA funds. I just want that we're gonna have such an influx, we already have an influx of money, right? And then we're gonna be getting more. And just, just keeping in mind where we can and can't use that, and we can't use those funds for public pensions. So what are the things that we can use? To make significant impact on the public pensions at this point in time, when we have these other funds available for some of those other initiatives, feels important to me.
Well, and the nice thing about doing things like infrastructure and other things that we're looking at is that if we can structurally change the state of Vermont to increase productivity, increase the likelihood that people want to move here, earn here, play here, stay here, it will increase as a second order effect the general fund funding, which we then can put and should put towards the pensions and the, so, it's what comes first, the chicken or the egg?
Oh, and.
It's the first time I've heard of the egg.
The bacon comes first. Any thoughts on? Oh, I'm sorry.
So I guess cannabis revenue is already, going to make its way into the general fund. I'd be interested in the legislator's perspective on sports wagering. We know, I know that's something that the governor does support. I believe, I think one chamber put it forward and there was some disagreement about that, but JFO, I think, is doing a full study on it. I'd like to know where folks stand on that.
Are you asking legislator?
Yeah.
I don't know that.
That's also, no.
I'm fine with it personally, but there's 180 of us that are all gonna have different opinions.
Right.
at some level.
I agree, I'm absolutely fine, but the people are doing it now, they're sitting in Vermont figuring out a way to sports bet, and we're leaving that money on the table.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it much at all. But if we get money from it, go into the general fund and figure out where to put it.
Finding consensus on revenue can be difficult. It seems like this might be an area where it could be consensus, but
You mean
I-
for the income itself or for the use of it?
well, I'm leaving aside, I know I'm hearing what you said about dedicated revenue, just the idea of, increasing the capacity of the state to meet
Oh,
obligations and desire.
Yeah.
Spend.
I think if you're gonna push the new revenue, I would think your best suggestion would be come up with a dollar amount, how much new revenue would be needed, and then, because even if the report, you could identify some sources that could come up with that in the report, but my guess is just the way the building works, it has to go through so many different committees, and, does the appropriations committee want to allow dedication, does the ways and means of the finance committee want to do it? They're gonna debate all that out.
Sure.
Usually what we do, like, if I'm in agriculture and say we want to do free lunches for everybody, we know it's 22 million. We know we usually send a letter to those committees saying, we're passing the policy. Here's how we propose, or here's some ideas on how you guys can pay for it and or whatever. And then they hash that out. So, I think instead of us getting caught up on this specific revenue stream at this amount, if the proposal of the group is that new revenue is needed or different revenue needs to be redirected, I think the dollar amount probably would get you as far as coming up. We spend so much time arguing over the what, and not the, just, if you're looking for a third of this to be made up with new revenue, or 40% or 80%, whatever the number is that that you might propose. My suggestion, just how this whole process works, would be come up with that number and, getting the consensus among this whole committee what that number is, if you can get one. I mean, you have to do a lot of convincing to get me to add $1 of new revenue, but, some you might not need to, but that would, I think, be the healthiest way for you to go about doing that.
I appreciate that perspective, just the dynamics of how the discussions work. I think that's kind of where Andrew was going originally.
Yeah, and I did about those three numbers of, I didn't put a percent, but 30 million, 50
Yeah.
million, 75.
Without identifying the source, just where, if you
Yeah.
put this much in. what-
Yeah, and, you know, my thought was looking at those three different numbers to see
Yeah.
what the impact is, knowing that we're not deciding necessarily exactly where that money is coming from, but, you know, if we're putting out ideas for people to consider come January, hey, this is how we think you could possibly go about that. I was my assumption that the actuaries would run those numbers, and I realized that the actuaries, we don't need the actuaries to run those numbers, it sounds like JFO.
It depends on how you want the money to be treated. So if it's a matter of, and I can tell you right now, the impact of $30 million increase will be on the ADAC, it'll save
Times $30 million.
it's 30 million extra bucks yet, and you can put for the ADAC, but if the intent is to model out what would happen if we charge a dedicated revenue source, for example. And then at the end of the fiscal year, swept the amount of money that came in from that revenue source and put it into the pension fund. What does that do to hold future ADACs? That we would need the actuaries to model. Then the group will want to model that.
But how would you even do that? Because you wouldn't know what the revenue was from the source. Say the cannabis fund. If we decided that that was a revenue source from here, although we would run into a lot of resistance from the higher education people, because that's where they wanted to go, and the mental health people wanted to go there, and early education wants it to go there. So
We would
after
have
school.
to work on an assumption based on the dollars rather than.
The source, yeah. And that kind of just gets to my point is
Okay.
pick the number, have them run it, and then if we could spend days debating what tax revenue and it doesn't move the issue.
And it's
further.
much easier for an actuary to say, if you tell an actuary, tell me what the impact will be with an extra $20 million starting now with this growth assumption, and it's going to be accounted for this way. They can project out what that does to the amortization schedule. It's much harder to ask them to do the reverse calculation, where you ask them to say, how much money would it take to lower some future ADAC by so much? That is a much harder thing.
I think that is the question, because you're right, if the task force says, no, take money directly towards the agency, there isn't a lot of analysis that needs to be done on that, but if the recommendation is to vote X amount of dollars above the ADAC, we'll need to have that information from the actuary in order to evaluate whether that is something that has merit or not.
So can I ask a touchy question here, maybe? When we're talking about additional revenue, are we including in that additional employee contributions? Because I know that what we talked about before was that when the employee contributions were set, it was at a different period in time, and they've kind of grown based on that. So if we're looking at additional revenue, are we also potentially looking at additional employee contributions? I know Corey said that he pays 10% of his
10.75.
yeah, into his fund. So is that also looking at that as an additional revenue source? Or are we only looking at general fund tax supported revenue? I'm just asking, Peter.
I was talking to someone yesterday about this, and as I said, to him, there is a range of options. It starts with do nothing, and it ends with cancel the pension completely. And in between those two, there's an infinite number of options. And as best we can, we should be looking at all options that actually make a difference. So yes, we should be looking at employee contributions as well.
But not as a designated revenues, like, I think those things are
Well-
separate.
Well,
They're two
no,
separate
because if
If
you
you're
had
making
more,
it, you're designating it. I mean, we
Right.
can't touch it. We should, touch it. If you're making that contribution, we should not touch it.
right, we should, but it would be additional revenue into the retirement system.
Into the normal cost, right? All of
Yeah.
our.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I agree with Kid. It strikes me as a different question, but I think we should look at it. And in the end, it is more money. Plans. I Certainly agree with that. But, you know, you can also think about how do we do that with the funding policy? Does it all go towards, same question about additional revenue, does it all go towards reducing the ADEC, or can there be an unfunded liability benefit to a portion of it? And I'm not sure if they scale from the actuary's perspective, like if we have them look at X million dollars and contribution increases could be a fifth of that, whether they would scale independently, or whether we should have the actuary look at a range of options that might. Some might be more appropriate for new revenue, some might be appropriate for a portion of the contribution.
I think just for context, the wage contributions cover roughly half the total normal cost crossovers. The analysis that you all requested the actuaries to do, which is really look at the normal cost first and see how much do employee contributions pay as a share of each of the small ones. But aggregated across all groups based on the most revised assumptions, I think it's like 53.6 or so% of the DSERS total costs covered by employee contributions. So it stands to reason in the status quo situation. If there's an upward adjustment in employee contribution rates, that extra money would essentially fund a greater percentage of the normal funds. And that would save the impact because it's a dollar that is not going in that. But I think what you're saying is it makes sense to implement an alternative funding arrangement where that additional money that comes in from that increment would also go toward paying down the unfunded liability. I think the way to do that would be basically hold the ADEC arms from it. But that also kind of undercuts the one goal of the task force, which is
I see a portion.
hold on, I'm sorry.
Can we take a, just a quick break? Because I just wanted to, just think about, because I think you have your list of the things that you want to propose, right, Jeanette?
No, oh, no, not that I want to.
Not set in stone, but just some things that you want to throw out there, right?
Well, I just pulled them off the last meeting that you have and have been adding to them since during this meeting. That's all. They're the same things that everybody else heard at all the other meetings, but we could take a short break if you want. Can we do that? 10 minutes break?
10 minutes?